Hello, fellow risk takers, and welcome to my worst investment ever. Stories of loss to keep you winning. In our community, we know that to win in investing, you must take risk, but to win big, you've got to reduce it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm on a mission to help 1 million people reduce risk in their lives. To join me, go to myworstinvestmentever.com and sign up for the free weekly Become a Better Investor newsletter where I share how to reduce risk and create, grow, and protect your wealth. Fellow risk takers, this is your worst podcast host, Andrew Stotts from A Stotts Academy. And I'm here with featured guest, Maxwell Nee. Maxwell, are you ready to join the mission?
Yes, absolutely. I have to say, Andrew, I love that intro. That thing you said about your worst loss to keep you winning. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's funny because a friend of mine, Bevan, who helped me a lot in the beginning of this, he and I reworked that about 50 times to try to come up with,
Yeah,
you know,
it's great.
stories of loss to keep you winning. So I appreciate
Yeah.
that. Let me introduce you to the audience. Maxwell Nee is the managing partner of OENO Wine and Whiskey Investment. He's a multi-award-winning entrepreneur who earns his investors a recession-proof and market-beating return with wine and whiskey alternative investments. Maxwell, take a minute and tell us about the unique value that you're bringing to this wonderful world.
Yeah, well, let me start with a story, right? So, wine and whiskey investment, a foray that really stands out for me is I was in Chicago. Went to this fancy bar. I was there for a holiday. I'm Australian. I'm not from the US. Visiting an old friend who I'm very close to, and we go to a bar that has dancing and all that sort of thing. We sit at the bar and they say to us, you need to spend at least $75 to sit here. I said, okay, cool. We've got a $150 table tab, plenty of room to move. Can't go wrong, right? And it's a lot of money, right? In Australia, that's like $110, so it's plus tips, a lot of money. So anyway, I sit there and I say to myself, I want to order an old fashioned. So an old fashioned is like usually a bourbon or whiskey drink. I like to have it whiskey. If you know anything about whiskey, you probably know Macallan. So Macallan's a bit like the the apple of whiskey. And he said, look, you can choose between a Macallan 12 and Macallan 18. And a Macallan 12 it's been aged in the barrel 12 years. Macallan 18 is the same liquid, just aged 18 years, right? 6 years difference. And I said, you know what? I'm on holiday. Screw it. Let's do an 18. I don't usually order an 18. So I'm having this drink and it's delicious. Like, give my friends some. It's fantastic. And then I asked the bartender, I said, so how much again was this drink? Didn't even ask, right? And he didn't tell me. And then he said to me, he said to me 125, and I said no, not how much we've spent so far. How much is this drink here, like this Macallan 18 old fashioned? He said 125. I said no, not the bottle. How much is this drink? And he said 125. And then my friend sitting next to me just laughing, sort of like spitting my face as he's laughing. And I said, wow, okay, cool, well, committed now. How much is the Macallan 12 old fashioned? He's like 25. And I thought, wow, 6 years difference equals a 500x difference in the investment of this asset, right? And that's started to open my mind to how this market moves and the fundamentals behind this market, right? Because I'm the end consumer paying 5x more for the asset. So ultimately, the way I help people invest in wine and whiskey is to get on the seller side of that of me, the poor guy in the bar in Chicago, paying for that drink, and allow people to ride the appreciation wave of how these assets age.
And how is it structured? Are they investing in a vehicle? Are they investing in a particular barrel? Are they investing in a fraction or something like that? How does that work?
Yeah, so we have two options, right? We have people can invest in their own private portfolio, whether they want to hold bottles or casks in their own name. We'll have them to choose it. Buying at the right time, buying young, buying at wholesale price, and then help them to exit it. And we also have an investment fund in the US in Delaware, where we're basically it's a bit like a typical, I think it's called a mutual fund in the US, where instead of shares or whatever, it's wine and whiskey as the hard assets.
And so you're buying, what is the person getting when they buy into that? They're getting a fraction of that. They're getting a bottle. They're getting a cask. They're getting what? Or they're
Yeah,
getting
so
a
in the
share.
private Yeah, in the private portfolio, they get the actual ownership of the bottle, so you could actually take them out of the storage and insurance and actually drink them if you wanted to. Um, in the investment fund, yeah, you own your own, for example, allocated shares of the fund,
Mm,
and the fund will return what it returns, whatever it is. Last year for our clients, we did 15.87%, which is not bad and it's great, and that was in the time of on the back of COVID and all that sort of thing. So you earn your percentage of that and then be paid out at the end.
and how are you calculating that return? Is it like your estimate of the value of that, of how much the value is appreciating, or how do you understand that return?
Yeah, so it's both an art and a science.
Mm,
The science part is that there is an index. There's actually an index for wine that actually tracks wine a bit like the stock market, exactly like the stock market. And then there's extra steps as well, because all these assets are hard assets, they're insured, just like if you were to buy a house investment, that to be insured, you need to be independently valued. So that's where the art side comes into it. So you
mm.
actually have valuers that come in and assess the assets to determine a value, and then we go to market with them and see if we can even beat that value once we go to market.
Right. And what is the simplest or easiest way for someone, let's say someone's listening and they think, I'd like to allocate a little bit to that. What's the simplest way? What's the minimum amount, that type of thing for them to do that?
Yeah, so what I would say is, if you wanted to join the investment fund, the minimum is about $250,000 US
Mhm.
dollars.
Yep.
Anything less, I recommend the private portfolio. Either way, I can share with you guys some links to put in the show notes
Yep.
here. But if nothing else, if you add me on LinkedIn,
Mm.
my personal email, Maxwell Nee, is all over LinkedIn. And I'm pretty active on there. Got about 20,000 connections. So send me a connection and I pretty much respond to everyone. Yeah.
And just one last question about that. And I'll have all that in the show notes. And I know plenty of my listeners are looking for alternative investments. So it's definitely, worth checking it out, I think. And, what you've already talked about is that the return was a strong positive return in a negative market year, not only for the market,
Yeah.
but also for bonds. So if you want to look at the value of this as an alternative investment, giving a uncorrelated return, well, it did it last year, and that's pretty impressive. One of the questions I have is how, from a size perspective, how difficult is it to get big? If real big institutional money comes, is this a niche that really can only absorb, I don't know, let's just say $50 million, as opposed to, no,
Mhm.
it's multi-billions, or is it, what is the size of the market like?
Yeah, great question. Really great question. So the total wine and whiskey market is last time I checked, it's at least 400 billion. So it's like a pretty decent economy. The ones that we invest in is the top 1%. So we're looking at about 4 to 5 billion
Mm,
as a top 1%. And we choose the top 1% because they sit in their own league, a bit like the luxury economy. Ferrari doesn't need to worry about contraction like
yeah.
Toyota and Honda need to. So yeah, 4 to 5 billion.
Okay. Well, I want you to keep in the back of your mind the answer to the question I'm going to ask you later, which is, what is your number one goal for the next 12 months? Because I'd love to hear about it. But why don't we go into the big question of the day? And now it's time to share your worst investment ever. And since no one goes into their worst investment thinking it will be, tell us a bit about the circumstances leading up to it, and then tell us your story.
Yeah, great. I love this question. I love the whole concept of this podcast. So I was 21. I was in Brisbane, Australia, and we were going through. Um, so the city that I lived in was it's a property investment. The city that I lived in was in the middle of transitioning between everyone living in houses, people starting to live in apartments, and so there was all these big apartments coming up. Apartments being built everywhere, which created a massive oversupply because the council was just approving them, and then the banks were just funding them. So that was just like a massive oversupply. So I bought an apartment in Australia off the plan. So off the plan means that like the apartment was worth about 450,000 Australian dollars, and you have to pay 10% deposit, but it's not built yet. So it'll be built in, 36 months, 3 years or whatever. And then you pay the rest when you settle, right? And, I was in love with this thing because I walked into the showroom and, I was definitely sold. I walked into the showroom and it was like, I used to watch the show Suits, the legal show with the guy in New York, and the showroom looked like his apartment. And I was like in love with that lifestyle, like that, young professional living in New York City, like all that sort of stuff. So I was sold on the lifestyle and didn't even really care about the apartment at the price, which like most things are, you're sold on the emotion and then the logic comes after. So I put the deposit down, didn't have the money for the deposit. So I borrowed to borrow the deposit. I borrowed the money for the deposit, paid it back. So I was like, I got 3 years to pay this back and then save some money extra, right? So plenty of time. And as you're committed to something, you're already committed to an investment. What I've learned is that you only find reasons to fall more in love with it. So it becomes harder and harder to walk away, even if it looks bad. You know what I mean? Like it's like all those guys that invest in
called confirmation bias.
Yeah, exactly. All those guys that invest in those big scams. Like I was watching the Bernie Madoff series on Netflix, and what I could really feel was once people were in for $1 billion, they didn't want to hear any more bad news, right? Because you're already in for $1 billion. So this felt like $1 billion to me. And at that point, I spent 3 months picking furniture, so really falling in love with this thing, furniture, forks, cups, like glass, crystal, whiskey tumblers, like all this stuff, right? And then didn't do any due diligence on the stupid thing. And then I saw an article that was first sign of bad news, because I got 3 years to settle this investment. The first sign of bad news was about halfway through, I saw an article saying that the developer, because the place was so city centric, it was in a very noisy part of the city, so in a bit of like the nightlife part of the city. So the developer was, I don't think the right term is sued, but he was like legally obligated, according to the local council, to invest $10 million in like triple glazed glass, so that the people living there didn't have to hear like the night clubbing and all that sort of stuff. So that's not a good sign, because that means the developer's got to take that $10 million out of somewhere else, and all of our apartments get smaller with triple glazed glass. And that sort of stuff started to unfold, which I totally didn't think about. My first investment, and didn't look at the metrics, didn't know anything about the developer, and people were saying stuff to me before I even signed. Oh, you sure? But the train had already left the station, right? Confirmation bias. And so then the place comes time for the place to settle, and I've spent another fortune on furniture for this place. It hasn't even settled yet, because I kept seeing what's it called, sales, like King Furniture Living, 50% off. I thought, oh wow, I might as well grab it now because I need it anyway. So and then what happened was, and this document to settle is a legally binding document. It's called an unconditional contract. So no matter what happens, like, they could effectively bankrupt me, which they did threaten, because I didn't want to settle. So then I work at the bank at the time. I go to get the loan. The valuer goes into value the property, and he's like, look, I can only value this at like 88% of what I signed for, and I've got to settle for what I signed for. So I'm 12%. My property, my expected value has already lost 12%, and I thought, wow, it's already lost 12%. And then I started forecasting how long would it take for me to get back to parity. It would take for me at least another cycle, 7-8 years to get back to parity. And then I'm not really ahead because of inflation, so I thought, wow, it's going to take me, like, it's just I'm already starting so far behind the finish line in such a losing position. how's that going to work? So then I go to settle, and then I decide to right at the last minute, I get the loan approved and everything. I had to put in more money than what I, really wanted to, all that sort of stuff. But I worked at the bank at the time, so I could get a good rate and good deal and all that sort of stuff. And I decided last minute, I'm like, you know what, I'm just gonna walk away. Even if I lose a deposit, $45,000, I'm gonna walk away because it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make any sense. And I was, 21, or by this time I was 24, young and a little bit irresponsible. Yeah. Well, if they want to bankrupt me, they could bankrupt me. Right.
What was the deposit amount?
24, 45,000.
Right. Oh,
Right. 45,000.
that's a lot to walk away from.
2 years. Yeah, it was. It didn't feel like at the time because that was money from 3 years ago,
Right.
But yeah, it was, and I almost didn't. But then I thought, no, it just doesn't make sense. I'm cutting off my, I'm cutting off a finger rather than cutting off my arm.
Right.
In terms of like the commitment,
And by leaving them with the deposit, does that relieve you of any legal obligation, or they're still try to?
No. So they still tried to extract it, Right. So I ended up having to go back to the agent, who was a friend of mine, who felt bad about the situation. She's like, oh my God, I had no idea. Like, this was meant to be a fantastic project. The market was meant to, this wasn't meant to be oversold and overpromised and whatever. And then she helped me to find a replacement buyer, of which they only signed the deal because I signed over the deposit to them. So I managed, by the skin of my teeth, I managed to avoid like the legal pressing of the law firm, which started in bankruptcy and whatever, and then assign my deposit over to the new buyer, and they've got the asset today.
Right. And how would you describe what you learned from this?
Yeah, so as I described, I learned that I'm an extrovert. I'm very like passionate, fiery. You can probably tell in the way I'm speaking. Emotionally charged, in like a passionate way. So I learned that, it doesn't hurt to. It never it might feel like at the time because it feels like it's urgent or whatever, but it never hurts to just like chill out and think about something. And it also never hurts to look at other options, and it's almost a red flag if you're that attached to something. So okay, that's what I really learned. I learned that when you're attached to something, that's a red flag. That doesn't mean like the stars have aligned and the universe is giving you like this once in a lifetime shot or whatever. If there's any attachment at all, you've got to just double check yourself.
Yeah. Excellent learnings and an interesting story. Maybe I'll share a few things that I took away. It's interesting, to go back. I loved your story about Chicago and how you started your business, and that was interesting. Also, going through the story, and it's an important one for the listeners out there about how property works, off plan, you see something, you think that's interesting. I remember I saw a condo on the street next to mine, and every time I walked to the park, I saw them building this condo, and the street that condo was on connected to the park. So I thought, this is a really, good location and looks interesting. So I did the same thing. I bought something off plan, and I watched them as they built that thing, and they stayed on track and all that. But by the time it got done and I was going to move in, I realized, first of all, it was half the size of the one that I lived in at the time that I was renting. So I was kind of hesitant to move into it. And then I just found that it wasn't my thing. And then I rented it for a while, and then I realized I'm not a landlord, and then I sold it. And in the end, I got, probably 1% return on average over the years. And so it kind of brought me back to that story. One of my takeaways from what you're talking about, first of all, is confirmation bias. And that is the idea of looking for things that confirm your decision. And I think that's what happens to all of us. And so you have to really be aware. I think the best way to look at that is kind of like, you could call it the white Toyota syndrome. As soon as you buy a white Toyota, you realize the world is full of white Toyotas. Everywhere you look, you see one. You've obviously made a smart decision. But if I think about it, my biggest takeaway is that property can be a trap. And it's not an easy liquid thing to get in and out of, like the stock market or let's say an index. And so when you go into, it's really important to do that research that you talked about, and you talked about slowing down. My notes that I just took was slow down, do your research, especially if you're attached. And I think my final takeaway is that, and I think this is critical for the listeners and the viewers, is it's okay to walk away.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing. I'll just add one thing. So probably an even bigger point is, if you're not an expert, it's your first time doing something, get a mentor, get a coach, or like just pay for it. Just pay for an expert if you can find one. I actually had a best friend who was an expert in the field who worked for a competitor, and I didn't even think to talk to him, so I didn't have the awareness of I don't know what I'm doing. But if you could just have that awareness, okay, you don't know what you're doing, and there's no harm in that because I've just never done it before. It's the first time you learn to drive a car, you don't just jump into the car, hope for the best. That ends up in a car crash. You get someone to teach you, and that's because you're aware that you've never done it before, and you're sitting there with like the steering wheel and you don't know what to do, right? So like everyone, especially in investing, like I think so many wounds or potholes could be avoided if people could just put their hand up more and like seek an expert, and maybe the expert doesn't work out. Maybe you need like 2 or 3, but that's far better off than what I did, which is just, cowboying into something I completely didn't know about where the stakes are really high.
Yeah. And that the saying penny wise, pound foolish is an interesting one. Like if you have to pay for the expert, it may even be better. It may force you to think about, I really got to listen to this, to what this guy's saying. So let me ask you the last question. And that is, what is your number one goal for the next 12 months?
Yeah, so my number one goal for the next 12 months is probably a bit similar to yours. It's basically to just educate as many people as possible, how much more is out there in terms of the world of investment. Obviously I've got a particular area of expertise with wine and whiskey, because the way I see it is this, the average person is usually 7 to 8 out of 10 educated on property because everyone knows about it. It's been, in the news for 1,000 years and all that sort of stuff. And the average person is probably like 0 out of 10 in terms of wine and whiskey investment. So I just want to bring that up to like a 7, and then the world will be able to make their own educated decisions on what's the best thing for them based on, so basically empower people in their investment journey.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, there you have it, another story of loss to keep you winning. Remember, I'm on a mission to help 1 million people reduce risk in their lives. If you have not yet joined that mission, just go to myworstinvestmentever.com right now and join my free weekly Become a Better Investor newsletter to reduce risk in your life. As we conclude, Maxwell, I want to thank you again for joining our mission. And on behalf of A Stotz Academy, I hereby award you alumni status for turning your worst investment ever into your best teaching moment. Do you have any parting words for the audience?
No, I'll just say that, guys, Andrew has got this podcast down pat. So subscribe, get in there. I really love this concept.
Appreciate it. And that's a wrap on another great story to help us create, grow, and protect your wealth. Fellow risk takers, let's celebrate that today we added one more person to our mission to help 1 million people reduce risk in their lives. This is your worst podcast host, Andrew Stotz, saying, I'll see you on the upside.